Well, welcome everyone. My name is Chris. I'm a Boswell Book Company bookseller, and I'm glad to welcome you. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ellie, who I believe is going to tell us a little bit more about REDgen and then start the conversation. So both of you, welcome.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for that introduction. As Chris mentioned, I'm here representing REDgen. I'm on the board of REDgen. We're a nonprofit organization here in the Milwaukee area, and we advocate for the mental health and the well-being of our youth through the lens of resilience. We work with schools and faith organizations and really the larger community, providing education through our curriculum, which is called Roots of Resilience. We also use resources and collaborations like this one with Boswell. So, hello, Dr. Gewirtz, Abby. Thank you so much for sitting down with us tonight.
It's my treat. It's an absolute treat to be with you, Ellie.
Wonderful. We're really excited to talk about your book, When the World Feels Like a Scary Place, Essential Conversations for Anxious Parents and Worried Kids. This is such a timely topic with so much going on right now.
Sadly, yes.
Yeah. Essential Conversations for Anxious Parents and Worried Kids. This title really summarizes your book a little bit, but would you mind giving us your own description of your new book?
Absolutely. So I decided to write the book about 4 years ago when I felt that the world was becoming or feeling like a scarier place. My kids were just becoming teens, but I looked at parents who had younger children, and I thought about, lockdown drills in school and severe weather disasters, the relentlessness of social media and technology, not to mention our quite divided society and social justice issues. And so I decided to write the book. I'm a clinical psychologist, a child psychologist by training, and all my career has been spent working to support families under severe stress and families who've experienced trauma. And for the last 10 years, our work has been with military families who serve and sacrifice on behalf of our country. And what I wanted to do was share the lessons that we learned from that research with families under stress, for families, regular families, who are dealing with how to share with their children things that happen outside the home, things that make us grown-ups stressed. And we know that when we grown-ups get stressed, that makes it even harder for us to help our kids navigate through this scary world. And so that's really, what the book is about. The first half is really helps parents with key skills that are then applied in the second half in a series of conversations about all kinds of different scary world events. I'm sure we'll get into it, Ellie. So.
Yeah, it's so important to make sure that what we're going through, our kids are going through it too, and we need to be able to have a way to talk about it with each other. I'm wondering, is there a favorite passage from the book that you wouldn't mind reading to us to give us a little flavor for what's inside?
For sure. I mean, I have to say my favorite passage is the very, very beginning of the book, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. It's called Trampolines, and I can read that and might give you a flavor. Most American children were just settling into the new school year in 2001 when the 9/11 attacks hit. I was a young mother of 3 that September the 11th and a newly minted child psychologist. In the days that followed, the skies were eerily quiet and fear coursed through our homes and communities. My husband and I, like our friends, were glued to the television. As a clinician specializing in trauma, I was also on the TV. Local outlets and newspapers sought me out for advice on how to talk to children about what had happened. I also spoke in schools, addressing teachers struggling to understand why their students, in places thousands of miles from New York City, Pennsylvania, or Washington, D.C., where the hijacked planes had crashed, thought the terror events had hit their own towns. I explained that young children have difficulty understanding concepts like time and distance. The replaying of the same footage day after day looked to them like new news every time. Attacks happening all around the country, including near them. We saw it in our own home too. Our 7-year-old son had just started 2nd grade. A few days after the attacks, he announced that he'd seen people jumping from the highest floors of the World Trade Center. It was on the TV when he walked into a classmate's living room. We were horrified. We had tried so hard to keep the news off when our kids were around. Nervously, I asked him how he felt about what he'd seen. His reply stunned us. Well, of course they're jumping out the window. I would jump out the window. Everyone should have jumped out the window. There was a pause. Why? I finally asked. Well, duh, he said, because of the trampolines. Our son's young mind couldn't conceive of a situation in which someone would jump to their death. He concluded the New York City firefighters must have put out trampolines to cushion the falls. His response was simultaneously heartbreaking and beautiful. He'd created a way to deal with the horror he'd witnessed using his 7-year-old capacity to process events. As parents, one of our most important jobs is to help children create their trampolines. It can be hard to remember how the world looks to a child. Time, space, human agency, all can seem distorted, compressed, and mysterious to a young mind. Children process events at their own level of development. It falls to us to give them mental cushions, not fictions, but ways of understanding the world, to help them face the horrible or unthinkable and process the anxiety and uncertainty these events can inspire. We want to give them tools to comfort and reassure themselves in age-appropriate ways when faced with the sometimes harsh realities of the world.
What a great summary of what the goal is here. Absolutely. Speaking of sometimes seeing scary things on our televisions, we are in the middle of a pandemic. We're seeing protests in our cities right now, and we're in the middle of experiencing a contentious election year. I think parenting has always been a pretty complex job, but in today's world, it feels like there are more challenges to navigate than ever before. So for parents who are feeling overwhelmed by it all, where do you start navigating these in a way that you don't end up transferring your own stress to your children?
Well, I have to say, Ellie, that was the way you talked about parents are stressed was, I would say, typical Midwestern understatement, wouldn't you say? I mean, I think parents are freaking out. It's so hard to parent. I mean, you said it, right? We're in, as if it wasn't bad enough that we were in the middle of a once in a century pandemic where we don't know whether our kids are in school or out, whether they're wearing masks or not, who's going to get sick, who's not going to get sick, whose grandma should we worry about? I'm a nurse, all these things. And then the racial injustice and the protests in the streets and the horrendous division in our society, and an election year, another incredibly contentious election year. So it is, I don't think there's any way to overstate how horrendously stressful it is to be a parent. You're supposed to be a parent and a worker and a teacher all at the same time, by the way, right? I mean, you're sitting in your home, in your office, and your kids are in the next room doing school. I mean, what's a parent to do?
Yes.
So I'm really, I can't say I wished, I'm so glad the book came out now, but I am glad that I could, that it's certainly a time that the book's needed in, I think, and as you alluded to, and as I write in the book, the first thing we have to do as parents is to get a handle on what's going on with us. So, one of the things I talk about in the book, it's one of my favorite things, is you get on a plane and they say, put on your own mask before assisting others. And that's really the principle here, that if we want to be able to do right by our kids, to help our kids navigate these scary world events, we first have to get an understanding of how they affect us. And then we have to be able to regulate our own big emotions. And boy, are we having them. I certainly haven't come across anyone who isn't having big emotions these days.
Yeah, it's touching us all, parents and non-parents and kids alike. We are all in the middle of something big right now. You did include a big chapter in your book about being in the middle of a pandemic and COVID. And in your chapter, you talk about the fears that we all have that you mentioned. What if a loved one gets sick? What if grandma gets sick? What if I get sick? And our kids are feeling these too. So you offer a lot of great ways that we can talk about that with each other. But I also wanted to bring up another repercussion of the pandemic that you just mentioned now. A lot of schools are offering hybrid or online classes right now, and it's can be very disruptive to families' routines and how they go about their daily life, how they go about working at the same time. And it can add a lot of stress. I know plenty of families I've talked to lately that is a great source of stress right now. What are the consequences of this new shift to being online, and how do we get through it?
Well, I think, I'm not an educational policy person, but I will say that the ramifications, I think, are really significant. So, for example, we know that there are huge disparities. Sadly, in Minnesota, we have one of the biggest problems of educational disparities in the nation. I don't know how Wisconsin fares, but we already had educational disparities, and we're coming off a summer. We're coming off 6 months where kids had no education at all. And what happens when some parents can afford to pay for tutoring for their kids or extra enrichment, and other parents cannot. And then you come back in September and you have a situation where kids aren't in the classroom, or they're sometimes in the classroom 2 days a week for 3 hours a day or whatever it is, and that you can bet your bottom dollar that the disparities have grown. And then you have disparities, and the disparities relate to home. If you have two parents working in overnight shifts or day shifts in factories, and they cannot be there, or you have parents who are expected to be working a full-time day with a 5-year-old in kindergarten who's expected to sit in front of the screen and get on with his work. It's really, I think we're going to realize afterwards how profound this disruption has been. And it's in the name of public health, which is really important. And we know ultimately we can't go anywhere unless we have a healthy society. So it's not that something can be done about it. It's just, it is a huge disruption. And I think one of the most important things to think about, and I don't say this in the book because I didn't anticipate there'd be a pandemic, but we've got to learn to forgive ourselves. We have to be willing to not be perfectionists. I think, anxiety goes along with perfectionism. All of us, we aspire, we want to do well, and we want that for our kids, but we have to be better at forgiveness in these times. And we have to, as an employer, as employers, we have to understand that employees can't work 40 hours a week from home and educate their kids. It's not possible. So what are you going to do about it, right? As a parent, you have to understand that you cannot work 40 hours a week and educate a child 40 hours a week and be a parent, So I think some forgiveness is really in order. And I don't really talk about that in the book. Had I known then what I know now, I would have. Because I think being able to regulate your emotions is also about being able to have compassion, not just for others, but for yourself as well. We're kind of lacking in that these days, I think.
Absolutely. You just touched on so many things, and it's unfortunate that it is essential that we talk about, we work towards public health, public safety, getting out of this, getting to the other side with people healthy. But as you mentioned, maybe the playing field is not quite as level as it was before. And it's time to offer ourselves and each other a little more forgiveness, a little more grace. I think that's a message that also needs to be heard right now. But our kids are feeling a lot of this too. So for kids who are just feeling overwhelmed by everything happening in our world right now, how do we support them in that feeling?
Right. So the first thing to think about is there are big things going on outside. And I think a lot of parents are so caught up, now more than ever, in the act of parenting. I remember, I have 4 kids. My youngest is now 17, but when I had 4 kids under the age of 9, and you said to me, what are your parenting values and your intentions? And I would say, I want to get through the day making sure that all my kids ate, making sure that no one left the house undressed, with shoes, and 3 hours sleep, right? It's hard to parent under the best of circumstances. And so it's easy for things to happen and for us not to get a chance to check in with our kids about those things, to converse, essentially. I think it was a lot easier in 9/11 when my son was 7. Those were easier times than having a 7-year-old today, because he didn't have one of these, right? When he was 10, he didn't have one of these. Now, by the way, the average age at which a child gets a cell phone is 10, and lower and lower by the year. So the problem is not only that there's a ton going on, not only if you're a parent, but also in the world today, but you also have parents and kids who are like, stuck to their phones because that's how the world gets in. And so we live in a highly distracted world. And I think that's one of the reasons I really was focused on conversations, what I call essential conversations, as a way to kind of anchor and help your kids through these difficult things. There is no substitute for you and me in a room together, sitting down, no phones, no TV, just focused on each other, talking. And it can occur beautifully around the dinner table when we all sit around and talk, right? Or it can occur when we're walking, going for a walk, walking the dog, or even when we're in a car driving. But those conversations are absolutely crucial, because do you want, if you're faced with a choice as a parent of, do you want your child to hear about coronavirus or schooling or racial injustice or whatever it is from you, or from the kid they sit next to on the bus? I've never heard a parent say, I'd rather my kid learn about these things from someone else. But in order for them to hear about it from us, we have to engage in conversations that allow our kids to feel heard, to feel validated, and to be able to problem solve and get to a place where they can feel empowered and positive, rather than what we often feel nowadays, which is disempowered and helpless.
Right. I'd like to dig into that a little bit deeper. I mean, your whole book is about those really essential, important conversations that we use to discuss and process feelings with our kids. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's the first step? How do you go about having those conversations?
Yeah. Well, so let's take an example, because I'd rather speak in practicalities. And, let's say your 10-year-old comes into the house, she's been playing in the street with the neighbors, socially distanced, of course, and she runs in and she slams the door, and you're just finishing up a work meeting, so you're kind of irritated because she slammed the door and all the people on the other end of the Zoom went, and you come out of your office or room, whatever, and you come in and you see that she's crying, and you say whatever you say, like it could be of, oh, that's why you slammed the door, or what's going on, and she says, Mommy, I just spoke to Janie and her grandma's in the hospital with the virus, and Mommy, what's going to happen? And and so we talked a little bit ago about what happens to you, right? So there are many things that could go through your head. It could be like, oh God, I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want her to start to know someone who got sick and who's sick enough to be in the hospital, because I know she worries about her own grandma, who's my mom, and I worry about my mom too. All these things, right? And your instinct is going to be likely, honey, it's okay. Don't worry. It's going to be fine. It's all going to be okay, right? The problem is that kind of a response, which is what I would call a reaction, right? We're swept away by this, and we immediately react by saying, it's going to be okay. Just calm down. It's going to be okay. That bypasses all the stuff that she's feeling. Mm-hmm. And it tells her what you're feeling, like, just leave that alone. It's going to be okay. Just mom doesn't really want to talk about it. Mm-hmm. Instead, and so I have these sort of red light, green light conversations, right? That was a red light conversation. That was when I'm swept away by what I think and I just dump it. The green light conversation allows me to take it maybe a deep breath. Oh God, the time has come. She knows someone who's someone close to them is very sick. And so I'm going to take a deep breath and I'm going to say, honey, you look pretty upset. I can hear and I can see that you're really upset. I can see there's tears in your eyes, and that tells me, and your brow is furrowed, and that tells me that you're really worried or sad or anxious about something. Is that true? And she might say yes or no or whatever, and you say, and what are you feeling in your tummy right now? Because I know that when I get really worried or sad, like I feel it, like I have a heaviness in my tummy, or I have butterflies, or my heart, is your heart beating fast? Oh, let me feel it. Yeah, that's a sign that you're anxious, that you're worried. So what you've done there is you have helped her to label what she's feeling. And what's important about that is that feelings are important signals, right? Think about anxiety, right? Anxiety is a powerful signal that something's wrong. There's something we should be worried about. You know, in the olden times, it saved us from the lion, the anxiety, the fear. And so what you're saying is, okay, this is a real thing, this thing called anxiety, and it's associated with how you feel and how you look on your face and what happens in your body. And that's very, very important, because it's important for us to learn about feelings. We need to be able to use them properly, right, to respond to them. And then what you say is, then what you move to is validating the feelings. So she says, I'm so worried about my friend, her grandma's in the hospital. And you might say, you know, I remember when I was maybe just a little bit older than you, my best friend's mom was really sick and we didn't know what was going to happen. She was in the hospital, and she was okay in the end, but we really thought she might not make it. And I was so worried. I was worried about so many things. And what that tells your child is your worries are valid. Like, and you could validate, the validation I gave is by personal example, but you could just say, like, I think anyone who heard that their best friend's grandma or mom was in the hospital would be really worried. You know, so you validate, that's what you do next. And then you have the opportunity to have her tell you what's going on, right? Now, often we think we know what our kids are worrying about. Yeah, I know, she's worried about her friend's grandma. But when you sit down and listen, you realize, oh, no, she's not just worried about her friend's grandma. She's worried about me getting sick. She's worried about her grandma getting sick. What happens if I die, right? What happens if I get sick? Her parents, I mean, that's a very, unfortunately, a very common worry. I mean, it's the ultimate fear of every child. And here we are in a pandemic and people close to her are really sick. And so, but that's a hard thing for us to hear, right? Which is why we have to go back to dealing with our own emotions so that we can really truly listen to what our kids have to say. So you have the opportunity to listen. And if you need to take a moment, you can go get a glass of water or go get a cookie or whatever it is. And that's not quite the end of it. So there's one more really, really important step, which is when she's had the chance to tell you what's on her mind, you then have the opportunity to problem solve. You have the opportunity to help her feel less anxious, but also to deal with the situation at hand. And the reason that's such an important last step is because what you don't want is, you don't want your child leaving the conversation having said all the things that are worrying her and having you said they're there, and then there's nothing she can do.
Mm-hmm. Sure, it's just hanging out there. So red and green light conversations, your book is full of them. You give examples of them all throughout every topic that you discuss in your book. When you're in the middle of that conversation, what triggers you to, and what I'm saying, is this a red light comment or a green light comment? Am I being, am I validating and supporting and helping to solve a problem, or is this actually pushing down feelings or devalidating?
Right, that's a great question, Ellie. So what I would say is, one thing you can say to yourself is this comment for me or for her, right? Mm-hmm. Is this making me feel better, or is it really in the service of her? So I think that's one thing. And it takes practice, right? It takes practice to figure out to pause before we say something. It takes parenting is hard work, and it takes a lot of practice. And so I again, like back to the theme of forgiveness, I think the goal of my red light, green light is not for parents to say, oh, I do the red light all the time. I'm such a terrible parent. You know, I joke with people, you know, how do you think I got all these great red lights? Like, been there, done that, right? But the idea of the red light, green lights is really to think about, like, how would this conversation be different if I had the opportunity to think about it, to reflect on it, to take a deep breath when I want to say something? In general, if you've had time to step back and pause and plan the conversation, that's going to be likely a green light conversation.
It reminds me of something you touched on earlier about, you know, recognizing your own feelings, maybe reflecting on that. If it's okay with you, I just want to read a couple sentences from chapter 2 in your book, which is about our own stressors and our, you know, parents' own feelings. You say, only by understanding what stresses us and how that affects us, the feelings, thoughts, and actions that stress provokes in us, can we respond effectively to challenging situations. That training, learning to govern our own responses, is the starting point for helping our children manage theirs and helping everyone feel calmer even when things seem scary. And so this whole chapter is about, you know, parents themselves and their own feelings. Can you talk about why that is so important?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so first of all, I'll just say, we don't learn about feelings, right? we don't. Like, you know, I think it's great that now in schools they have SEL, you know, social emotional learning curricula, and that's wonderful. But, you know, these are very, very new things. And as families, you know, we sit down, we'll talk, we'll have a great conversation, but we don't necessarily talk about feelings. You know, kids learn about feelings in 3 ways. One, they watch what their parents do when they get big feelings, right? When we get a disappointment, or we're really sad, or we're angry, they watch us. They're good feelings detectives, right? They see us. So that's one way they learn about feelings. Second way they learn about feelings is by the way we respond to their big feelings, right? Do we say, honey, I see you looking sad? Or do we say, stop crying already? Or do we say, big boys don't cry? Or, you know, how do we respond to their big feelings? And the third way is by discussing it. So in a way, it's very hard to coach your kids' emotions. And that's the sort of process that I laid out earlier. Very hard to do that without being aware of how you deal with emotions. And there's sort of 2 parts to that. One is we all have a go-to style. Some of us are just more stiff upper lip, right? We came from that, you know, I think that's maybe more Midwestern than West Coast or East Coast. I'm British, so like certainly is very familiar to me. And the opposite end of that is the let it all hang out, you know, like I'll just yell and scream, and right. So those are 2 extremes, and most of us are sort of somewhere in the middle, but we have a style that's one way or the other. And I encourage parents not just to think about their own style, but their spouses. Like, how do we work together? If there are 2 of us, you know, one is more, no, you know, my husband is more circumspect and more reserved than I am. And in some situations, sort of, it's great for him to go in there, and in others, because I know I'm going to be a bull in a china shop, and in other situations it maybe I'm the best person to go in. So those are the kinds of things that I encourage parents to think about, not just, you know, what's your style, what's your spouse's style, but also like how do you deal with stresses? Because ultimately your kid's watching you, and so and our children, they want to be like us. They want to do right by us. They won't tell us that, especially when they become adolescents, you know. But ultimately, we all want our parents' approval. That's one of the things that drives this beautiful attachment between parents and kids, in whatever way. So what we do and how we are in front of our kids is really, really, really important. And that's the part that I think often is so unintentional, because life is so goes past so fast, and it's only afterwards. You know, my mom told me this great story about when I was 2 years old and I was in the back of the car and she heard me swearing and she hadn't realized that we were on our way to a birthday party, and she was just praying that I would stop repeating the word that she'd said when she got angry by the time we had to go into this very prim and proper birthday party. But you know, every parent can tell a story like that. So that's the thing. It's really important for us first to navigate this stuff so that we can bring it in the way that we want to our kids.
Yep, they are always watching.
Yeah.
So for parents who maybe struggle to navigate their own or deal with their own feelings of sadness, anger, fear, if they're struggling to address that within themselves, what advice do you have for those parents?
So I think that being aware of that is phenomenal. That's really the first thing. I think awareness is powerful. And then, you know, if you know that you struggle with it, maybe because of an illness that you have, or, you know, mental health problem, it's really important to you know, to be aware of it and to acknowledge it, and also to be able to talk about that, right? And so I'm really in favor of parent timeouts, by the way, right? I need a timeout. I'm not going to be the best parent to you right now. So I think I'm just going to go over there for a little while, and then we'll talk about it in a half an hour or an hour. So, you know, and actually in our research, what we found is that, and we've done some research with mothers who are in homeless shelters and in domestic violence shelters. And we've done this research with parents moms who have been to war. There's almost no research on moms who've deployed to war, military moms, but we found sort of commonalities, which is that when parents can like set their own stuff aside in the service of parenting their kids, they can be more effective. But you can't do that until you can make sure that you have the support that you need to deal with your own things.
Wow, that is so sad and fascinating, but true and good to know that, you know, it's like you mentioned before, you've got to put your own mask on the airplane first, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to go back to these conversations again. I think this is maybe something that parents come across often. What do you do when your child closes the door? They don't want to have the conversation. They don't want to talk about it.
Yeah. So don't force them. That's the most important thing. I mean, everyone doesn't want to talk about stuff. Sometimes, oftentimes, the older they get, the less they want to talk, right? I give some tips in the book about how to deal with the adolescents who don't want to talk. But I think it's also important to recognize, just like we have different styles of dealing with emotions, so do our kids, and they might not match ours. And I think sometimes that is, so in the beginning of the book, I talk about the dance that we do with our kids. So when we have a new child, we learn to dance with them, and we might have different steps. Like I might dance fast, but my kid might dance slowly, right? They might be a shy, introverted, slow to warm up kid, and I might be a parent who loves to party, or the opposite, right? So we have to learn to dance together. And, you know, if we can do that, I think we can navigate. We can get there.
It's about practicing the dance.
Practicing the dance.
I love that. I want to touch on one more topic that I think is top of mind for a lot of parents before we open it up to questions in the chat here. Chapter 9 of your book is all about technology and our increasingly digital world. All these messages we're being bombarded with, especially now, and kids have access to the internet at the touch of a finger. So for parents of children who, you know, they want to talk to them and have conversations about safety and cyberbullying and healthy time limits, what's the right way to go about that conversation?
Yeah, so one of the things I say in that chapter is, I'm not going to tell you what to say. I'm not going to tell you what limits to set, but let's talk about how to talk about those. And so there are a variety of scenarios in that chapter, from the little child who sees what he shouldn't be seeing on YouTube, not as a function of anything you've done wrong as a parent, but because something slipped into YouTube Kids that shouldn't have, based on a true thing. The teen who is wrapped up in a really horrible case of cyberbullying. The kids who learn about stuff on the phone that's not, not real news, but, distinguishing facts from hearsay, things like that. So there's so many conversations to be had about the relentless exposure to technology and how you deal with it. The formula, what I say to parents is like, the approach to the conversation is the same. Like, think about what it is you want to talk about. Let's say you want to have a conversation with your 15-year-old about, sleep and devices, which I think is really, or maybe your 14-year-old, and you've decided these are your values. And I encourage parents to think about what their parenting values are at the beginning of the book with a really fun, my favorite exercise sort of. But basically, you've decided that the value in your house is, let's say, phones go in the bin. Everyone puts their phones in the bin, everybody, at, whatever time it is, 8 p.m., I don't know. And then there are no phones until 7 in the morning or whatever. But your conversation isn't just about that. Your conversation is going to, that it's going to be a big issue, but your conversation, you also want to help your 14-year-old navigate some sort of issues around what to put. Our kids are posting all the time. We don't even see many of what the things that they post because they disappear, Snapchat, whatever. So maybe this is a conversation about values as a family and what we do and don't put out of ourselves. I have, for example, a scenario in the book of a young girl whose boyfriend puts out, she's got, there's so many different scenarios. I'm mixing two, but there's one of a girl who has a photo of herself in, what mom thinks is too skimpy an outfit. And somehow the photo gets everywhere and mom's mortified and she jumps to the worst case scenario. Is my child sexually active and this is going to happen and everything like that. And so then you have a conversation that's about several things relating to how we're going to behave with regard to technology, basically. Mm-hmm. And the first most important thing to do is to get you on the same page. If there's two of you, if it's a two-parent household, even if it's a single-parent household and there's another parent somewhere else, be on the same page about the standards and things that you're hoping for. So that's really important. I think the second thing is, what are your boundaries? What are you willing to share and what are you not willing to share? And then the third is, what are the limits of the problem solving conversation? Like you might say, our goal here is to come to an agreement whereby you are putting down your phone at night and there's a way to make sure that the things that you're putting out are not going to be harmful to you. Mm-hmm. But within that, let's brainstorm the kinds of things that you think would help accomplish that. So you're not saying to the child, I say this and this is what's going to happen. And, and the child slams the door and, walks out, and what are you going to do? Wrest the phone from them. But more, it's, again, your child is empowered to be a part of the conversation. Just like when your kid comes running to you and crying because they broke up with their boyfriend and their boyfriend posted really compromising pictures of them. And wow, you're like horrified and you want to say, what were you thinking when you let him have these pictures? But you're never going to, you're not going to say that if you want to be effective. Mm-hmm. But you can solve the problem for your child, or you can say, let's sit down and figure out two things. One is how you can feel less anxious about this. And the second is, what can we do about the situation? And you brainstorm together and your kid's going to feel more empowered by being a part of the solution.
Absolutely. I want to open the chat to questions right now. So if anyone has any questions for Abby, Dr. Gewirtz, please put them in the chat. But while give someone a chance to type up any questions they have, I just want to say I love that approach of, you know, as far as technology goes, these are your rules, here's what you're going to do. It's, okay, we have these same values and these same goals we want to reach as far as, you know, safety or sleep is concerned. Let's figure out together what we can do to get there. I think that's would be a lot more receptive as an adolescent.
Right. And ultimately our goal is for them to raise them to be independent people, right? So we have to be able to scaffold them. It's a very psychological term, but we have to be able to give them opportunities to succeed and fail, like in our little bubble, but really to become progressively, slowly more independent.
Sure. I don't see any questions in the chat, so let me say something off of that real quick. I want to go way back to what you read to us about trampolines and kind of relating that to, you know, scaffolding and helping them to grow their own independence. So trampolines, this idea of having a mental cushion to kind of protect and accommodate them from the worst that they could possibly experience or see. How do you find the balance of doing that without completely enabling them too much? I realize those things there's a line to be walked.
Right. No, I think that's really exactly where this book is. That is exactly it. So, so I'll just give you an example from my own life. And this is, I love telling this story. So I have the most amazing neighbors. They have the neighbors, two, three, four families, very young children. And with what was going on in Minneapolis over the summer, the horrendous murder of George Floyd, and then the unrest that came after it, there were helicopters around. We're very close to the area that the unrest was happening in, and all the awful things relating to George Floyd's murder. And so there were helicopters around, and the kids, of course, were asking questions. And we had a lot of conversations, both between the parents and the kids, and also with the parents about like how you talk about it, and what you say, and how when your child is ready. And you know, one of my neighbors, her daughter, her 9-year-old, is a very anxious kid and a wonderful, really, really bright kid, the kind of kid who reads the newspapers when you don't necessarily want them to read the newspapers. And her swim coach had said, who's a young guy, like really well-intentioned, I'm going to take them to the George Floyd Memorial. And that meant that they would be driving through downtown, you know, the area that was, I mean, it was, well, when we drove through it right afterwards, we were sort of shocked. I mean, you know, stores were ransacked, burnt, boarded up, and just sort of, there was so much depth of feeling of what was going on. And you know, my own kids are teens, and so they found incredible meaning in the situation by going and volunteering at some of the food drives that were going on, because people really didn't have grocery stores because they were all shut. But what do you do with a young child? So my other neighbor has a 6-year-old, and as if the summer wasn't like a crazy enough summer, exactly that week she was biking around, she fell over and broke her leg. So this poor 6-year-old is sitting in her driveway, stuck in a chair, watching all the other kids doing all the other stuff, biking around, and she's just can't move. And so she and her mom are getting into conversations about what's going on and the helicopters. And her mom frames it, I think, in a really, you know, just such a perfectly age-appropriate way. And the child and the kid says, well, so there are people now, and, you know, there are people who don't have food because they can't get to the stores because the stores are all closed. Mom says yes, and they talk about what they can do about it. And so she says, like, I want to do something about it. So this kid with a broken leg. So she and her mom brainstorm, and the kid says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut some flowers from my yard, and I'm going to sell the flowers to my neighbors, and I'm going to use the money to buy food. Okay, so her parents literally carry her around the garden, hobbling around the garden. She cuts the flowers, she ties them up. They have one of those like radio flyer vans that they pull her down the street. We all, of course, like we're all buying flowers. She takes the money. She goes to her grandma. She's quite an entrepreneur, this kid. Her grandma doubles the money. And then she goes to the store and this kid and her friend raised $800. Can you imagine what it was like for them? This kid in a car, they go into the store and they are buying food to donate to the food shelter. I mean, it was like really such a beautiful thing. So this kid, this is a scary world. This is a kid who could have been so freaked out by the events that went on and her own accident that, she could literally have shot herself up in her house. Yeah. But she didn't. And she felt so good. Like this is a child who is, her parents are helping her take the steps towards being a confident, compassionate, engaged young person. And that's what I think we all want for our kids.
Yes, I love those stories about just resilient kids. Sometimes they'll surprise you. I just want to mention we have one question from Michael in the chat. Our teachers are trying to balance their passion for helping kids and taking care of themselves. What advice do you have for our teachers who are struggling to find that balance with this cognitive dissonance going on?
It's so hard to be a teacher because as if it wasn't bad enough to be in the middle of a pandemic and all the other stuff, you're also, I think, teachers are so caught in the middle between all these acrimonious sort of debates around should there be in class, you shouldn't, should, teachers have to, teachers don't, teachers, I mean, it's very difficult. And so I want to really acknowledge that. So it's a hard enough job to be a teacher anyway, when you don't have to be in a room with sort of 25 potential vectors of disease. I love kids, but they are, right? I mean, and really you're going to, how are you going to expect that a kindergartner is going to keep a mask on and keep social distance? And it's so hard to do it. Or you're online and you have the responsibility for educating these kids and you have no idea what's going on in that kid's living room. And you can't go out. I mean, it's just a lose-lose. It's such a hard thing. One of the things we talk to parents about is setting our kids up for success. And this is almost one of those situations where it's so hard, if not impossible, to set kids up for success. And I mean, I know how teachers work so hard and they try really hard within the constraints that they've been provided with. But, especially when it's all wrapped up in politics and, you don't even get to choose because it's your school board that votes what's going to happen. And it's hard. So again, I'd say to teachers, like, forgive yourselves, right? Have some compassion for yourself. Always make sure that you have self-care opportunities. And then, do the best you can, but maybe, if you have like standards and you won't allow yourself less than 100% normally, bear in mind that we are living in a less than a 100% situation, right? and do that, plan accordingly. And your kids will know how much you care for them and that you're doing the best you can. That's what we're all doing. It's the best we can.
That's absolutely right. That is such a good reminder. We have a couple more questions in the chat. I'm so sorry for anyone if we don't get to them all. Next question is from Amy. She says, how do you balance the desire to reassure your child while also allowing them to feel their feelings and create resilience? For instance, the example you gave with relating coronavirus to the fear of their own parents' death. How do you respond?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important. So it's really important to reassure our kids. So for example, and there is a difference between saying everything's going to be okay. I promise your grandma's not going to end up in the hospital, right? Which is something that we wish we could say, but if we say it, we can get into a lot of trouble. So the difference between that statement and the reassurance that says, I'm your mom, and it's my job to take care of you. And I feel pretty good about my ability to take care of you. And and it's my job to do that, and to keep you safe. And I am doing a pretty good job of that. Or, I am really working hard at that. So that has a different, both those statements attempt to offer reassurance. I think the second statement is a statement that you can stand behind in a way that you can't. We're often tricked into making false promises, tripped up into making false promises. So that's the thing that I most worry about when it comes to reassurance. I think what you're getting at, I think with the question, I wonder if one of the things you're getting at with the question is, so I think sometimes when kids are really worried and they kind of unravel, parents worry that if they validate their emotions, if they label and say, I would feel the same way, that they're encouraging kids to unravel more. And so I want to make it clear that I'm not, that's not where we want to go. When kids have big emotions, the best thing to be able to do is label and validate the emotion, and then leave it there until the emotions have settled down a bit. None of us are able to hold really good conversations when we're so emotional. Now, it's tricky because I think I've had parents say to me, well, I just get impatient because my kid cries and cries and cries, and then I validate, and then they cry more and they cry more and they cry more, and I don't know what to do. And so I think it's okay for us to say to our kids, I can see this is really, I see you're sad, and I can see this is really upsetting. And I would say that what we need to do now is take a snack, have a drink, take a rest, let's watch TV, and then let's come back to this. Mm-hmm. And set the expectation that you'll have a conversation when the time is right. And big emotions are not the right time for a conversation.
Absolutely. Chris, one more question? All right, one more question from Heidi. What advice do you have for parents trying to teach children that we can disagree with each other in respectful and productive ways, given that our national leadership consistently models things like bullying?
Heidi, thank you for that really important question, really. I mean, so I talk about civility, and actually there was a really interesting kind of, not controversy, but I had a really interesting conversation with some people about this idea of civility, because I guess even the word civility actually now is loaded, which I didn't realize, but I still didn't want to not put it in the book because some people have connotations to it. I mean, the thing is, respectful disagreement, so let's use your words, is so important. How are we going to talk to each other if we don't have respect for one another? And I think one of the hardest things today is exactly what you talked about, Heidi, which is we have historically relied on people beyond us to model respectful conversation. And in an era where we can't rely on that, it's all about what's going on in our bubble and then finding other bubbles where that happens. That makes it tough. But I think everybody, so I would say look in the community. I have a colleague, Bill Doherty, who runs this wonderful organization where people, reds and blues, talk to each other, right? That's the goal, is respectful disagreement. And I think in quite a few of the conversations, especially in the chapters on divided democracy, divided society, and social justice, there's one conversation about immigration, for example, right? I talk about how there are different sides of the issue, and what we want to teach our children is how to think about something in a way that doesn't denigrate the other side, but is respectful. How can we get engaged? Because if we can't teach our children that, we do run the risk that they will revert, just stay in the bubble. And ultimately, that's, I think, as American parents, we value our kids going out and being out in the world. So hopefully that's some way to respond, Heidi. Thank you.
Yes, respect is always an option, and I think we have plenty of opportunities to teach that, even in the middle of everything that's going on right now, and in the middle of all the challenges that are going on right now. This is a really helpful book for parents to read, so I thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Ellie. It was really a treat to be in conversation with you, and thanks to everybody. This was a fun fun opportunity.